And with me today is going to be your host, Guy, James and Michael. Business Propel is Australia's #1 business improvement SaaS software. So welcome everyone to the webinar, and I'll hand it over now to Guy.
Thanks, Phil. My name's Guy Thornycroft from Quinco, Quick Win Collaboration, and I'm your host for today's business success discussion, brought to you by Business Propel, diagnostics for your success. Today we're exploring one critical success factor for business, and that is the risk of being connected to the web. Let me introduce your subject matter experts. On this side, I've got James Ford. James is Innovation Counsel, founder and managing director of Blue Ocean Law Group. Innovation Counsel is a new term coined by James to define a new breed of lawyer, because James believes that the future of legal professions involves lawyers expanding their roles, being more proactive, delivering more value to clients, and improving the client experience. How? By collaborating with hand-picked lawyers across the full spectrum of legal matters their clients encounter, and playing a more strategic role on the boards of their clients' businesses to ensure more effective governance. So welcome, James. And on this side, Michael Perkins. Michael is from Nexus Legal, a third-generation practicing lawyer with Nexus Legal who heads up their private client services. He has 30 years experience in trusts and estates and co-authored the only estate planning textbook to be used in Australian university law departments. Michael is TEP designated from the Society of Trusts and Estate Practitioners, STEP International, for his expertise in these areas, and is a mentor and general counsel to a range of closely held businesses and families. So great to have you both here today.
Thanks, Scott. Just
a warning, nothing that we discuss here today is legal advice. So please seek independent legal advice if you think you have an issue along a topic that we bring up today. But a glossary of terms that we use will be available after the session. So please ask lots of questions in the notes section of today, and we will attempt to answer those for you. But certainly contact us afterwards if you have anything that you need to discuss further.
There will be a live chat section, so you can see on normally the right-hand side of your screen that you can actually put questions in there in chat or questions, and there will be polls during this webinar too, so look out for that too.
Thanks, Phil. So to start off with, tell me, gentlemen, why digital assets has become such a hot topic, and perhaps define for us what you mean by digital assets and online privacy.
Okay, I'll have a go at that first, Guy. It's an enormous question, but I think we're all instinctively aware that over the last 10 years, the internet has taken an ever-increasing part of our lives. It started with online music and online media, and it's only grown from there. So where we are now is that something like 90% of Australians access an online social media site every day in one form or another. So the internet touches our lives, it touches our businesses, it touches our wealth, it touches our families. So I think that largely is why it's such a hot topic. And when we look at this question of what is a digital asset, we can't think of it as in purely financial or property terms. In reality, a digital asset needs to be considered as either a file or an online account over which a person has some kind of ownership or control. So that can range from your account with an online service provider to the files that you produce in day-to-day business, to the photos that you take on your iPhone, just as three simple examples. So probably the watchword in this, when we talk about assets, we're really talking about those enduring elements of our connection with the internet and our devices.
Fantastic. And online privacy?
Yes, Guy, just following on from what Michael was saying, online privacy is the other side of the coin in terms of digital assets. It's the way we identify ourselves, and the Privacy Act 1988 Commonwealth defines personal information as anything that it could be an opinion. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. It doesn't matter how it's recorded, and it's anything that can be used to identifies an individual. So data that or can be reasonably used to identify an individual. Things that don't identify, like metadata or cookies on a website, for example, those things by themselves are not able to be considered personal information, and the federal court has held that metadata is not personal information, so it's not governed by privacy principles. The same goes for cookies. So in Australia, at least, cookies are not regulated by the Privacy Act.
So what does that mean for small and medium-sized businesses, James?
Well, let me just continue in terms of who the Privacy Act applies to. And it applies to businesses with a turnover of more than $3 million, but it also applies where the type of business is dealing with a sensitive type of information, like personal health information. It could be a naturopath or a gym or a childcare centre, a credit reporting body, or a specific registered employee or association. Any of those types of organisations will apply. But if your turnover is less than $3 million and you're not one of those types of businesses, you're not regulated by the Privacy Act. And this is a major misconception or misunderstanding that a lot of people have, because nearly every business has a privacy policy. And that's because it's expected. People approach on the internet, they approach a company, and if there's no privacy policy, they go, well, how do I know that any information I share is going to be looked after?
Fantastic. Anything to add to that, Michael?
No, that's a very comprehensive summary, and but I think it raises this question for business owners of understanding who they are connecting to, and I think the Achilles heel for any business is not the business's expectation of its customer, but the customer's expectation of the business.
Mm-hmm.
So irrespective of the legalities, I think that we have to be sensitive to broader social norms and expectations about privacy. And if you've got any aspirations of being a $3 million business or more, well, it's probably better just to get used to the idea of acting in the way you'd like to become scaled to. Because the only thing you can guarantee as your business grows and develops, once you do get over this magic $3 million threshold, the infrastructure cost of compliance goes up unless you've already got that scaffolding in place. Mm. So my general advice to growth businesses in the small to medium enterprise space is if you're serious about growth and development, make the decisions about infrastructure as early as you can afford to do so, because it'll certainly make scaling your business easier as your business moves forward.
And you make great points, is when you can afford to do so. A lot of people in the growth stage are so focused on getting those customers in, product market fits, etc. They're running through. It's the last thing until they get in trouble. Is sometimes the only time they actually stop and think about how important is prevention rather than dealing with the issue after.
I think that's right, but out of what James said, which I think the really big takeout from me is, irrespective of your turnover, understand whether you're going to be in one of these smaller businesses that are going to attract the liability anyway. So if you are in that small growth stage and you are one of the affected businesses, suck it up. Don't put your head in the sand.
Now, something you mentioned to me earlier on when we were talking before we started was about jurisdiction. So even though I have an Australian passport, I only deal with clients in this particular region. That doesn't necessarily mean that my business isn't exposed to a bigger jurisdiction through my online service providers.
Absolutely. No, don't forget, the internet is global. Once you've gone onto that internet on-ramp, there is no part of the internet that you're intrinsically prevented from reaching. So, and in that context of being in a global market, it's probably worthwhile people reflecting how many emails did you get during July with about a GDPR kind of change of terms and conditions? Every one of those received is one of your offshore connections. So you need to be aware that any kind of online presence can be connected to multiple jurisdictions. What that amounts to is really something you've got to look at on a case-by-case basis. But unless you work very, very hard at it, it's extremely difficult to lock any kind of internet site or service down to one kind of geolocation. And if you're using a generic website builder like, say, GoDaddy, you're already in the US, subject to US control over your data. And you're then subject to the Cloud Act, which is the America's new equivalent to our Privacy Act, and the GDPR regime in Europe. So you go, okay, going for the cheap option will generally take you into an offshore jurisdiction.
And
forewarned.
a lot of the cloud providers will have servers not based in Australia. So one of the things I'll just follow up with a little bit more detail about the GDPR, because there's been a lot of talk about it. It came into effect on the 25th of May this year, and the legislation affects Australian businesses where they're tracking, targeting, or open to dealing with EU residents. So just the fact that on your website, if you accept payment in euros, for example, is saying you're open for business for EU residents. If you have an office branch in the EU, then your company is dealing with EU residents as well, and you'll need to have compliance with it. And GDPR is a big deal because of the size of the penalties that they can impose, and they're talking 20 million euros or 4% of turnover, whatever is greater. So it's big numbers.
That's a serious punishment. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I suppose they're leading the world in protecting privacy of individuals. They're making sure that consent is express and recorded. And if your business is tapped on the shoulder and there's a question, you need to prove that you obtained the consent. So you need the internal systems in place to be able to back up when you've got that. So, and a lot of these things steamroll, because if you don't have the systems and processes in place, it won't just be one instance that you've got it wrong. It could be thousands of instances, and the penalties can ramp up. Yes, because it'll be a failure of the whole system, not just one instance.
Yeah, and if you want a convenient example, think of the Commonwealth Bank and their problems about anti-money laundering compliance. That's a good example where I think they said at the end that that the potential penalty under Australian law for those security breaches was something like $4 trillion. They settled it for 750 million. And the bank's share price went up as a result, because everyone understood the potential weight of that liability. So I vehemently agree with what James is saying. But I think what that leads us to is a consideration of something which first came up for me in the 1990s when we were working in the media industries, looking at the consequence of digitization. And if you didn't have stuff digitized on the internet, it wasn't going to be accessible. So then the fear was, well, digital amnesia will happen and society will be deprived of these online assets. Now we're at the other end of the spectrum, where GDPR is basically enforcing an obligation or a right of digital amnesia and anonymity on the global reality of the internet. And we've come there, so we've come there in what, 20 years. So goodness knows where we're heading to next, other than I think the need for more discrimination in how we connect with online-based services in one form or another.
James, next question perhaps for you. What are the trigger points for a notifiable data breach that all companies need to obviously to know about to protect personal information and data?
Well, the notifiable data breach scheme was introduced in Australia on the 22nd of February 2018, so it's fairly recent. And it applies to all companies who are governed by the Privacy Act. So everything that I said earlier, just repeat it for the national data breach scheme. The only exception to that is if your company is holding a tax file number. Doesn't matter what your turnover is, you will be governed by that scheme, and it's something definitely to be aware of.
So what do companies need to put in place to avoid a data breach?
Well, I think then we're onto a completely a new topic on cybersecurity and IT protocols in order to ensure that internal security is governed. But one of the things that there are simple things that all people in dealing with the internet can use, and this is not just for preventing data breaches, but it's also for, I suppose, your own personal protection, and that is using things like virtual private networks. Whenever you're on a open Wi-Fi connection that can be snooped by anyone in the area, as well as internally in business as well. So, two-factor authentication when you're accessing, so that even if your password is lost, you can still have some level of protection. You might get a notice that someone's attempting to log in, but they can't do it without possession of your mobile phone with your number. So simple things, but generally when I've attended the cybersecurity lectures, I've all said that the weakest link is where you need to focus your attention, and that's usually human, as in human error is what the hackers get into, and they will then someone slips up, and it's only one employee in your organisation, and your system's exposed.
Right. And what are the implications of a data breach?
Well, when you're regulated by the National Data Breach Scheme, and you have to tell all of those affected that are likely to suffer serious harm from the data breach, and also give them recommended steps as to what they need to do about it. So you'll need to have systems and processes in place to respond to when it happens. But this is something that occurred to me, and I know when I was talking to Phil earlier, he had it on the weekend as well, where you've been informed that there's a company that you're dealing with who have breached your data. And that happened to me a few weeks ago. And luckily for me, it was only contact information that is publicly available on LinkedIn anyway. So, very concerned, but in the end, it's okay. But how do I say it? The key is the reputation of that business is now in question. And it wasn't their own internal systems that did the data breach. It was a cloud system they were using to help provide better client experience so that the data could be collected in a nicer way. Right. So it wasn't even their own internal systems. And that's something that a lot of businesses aren't aware of with the Privacy Act, is that when they share customers' data through an external provider, you have to do due diligence on what systems and processes that external provider has, and if they breach the data, you're responsible. So you need to be very careful with who you engage with in the cloud.
I think maybe that brings us into a good time for the poll, Phil. We're gonna ask whether or not you know where the data that you hold on your clients is sitting, as a means of just awareness, just to work out how aware businesses are of this issue that you just brought up.
I'm a co-founder of a startup that we do collect tax file numbers for our clients. It's a conversion rate optimization startup. So we're looking at taking forms and recording that data for our clients for marketing purposes. As a small business, we've gone through the process of putting steps in place, but I know for a fact that if something happens with one of our clients, and we have to let everyone know that something's gone wrong, it would never happen to have a lot of security, but just saying, just putting it out there. For a small business, that could cripple my whole business.
Yes, we'll Phil, the statistics that are usually referred to in this instance with data breach talk about at least or around 60% of small business. We're not talking your Facebooks or your Telstras or any of that. We're talking small business, our audience today, that 60% fail within 6 to 12 months after a data breach.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that is still current in terms of what's going on, but certainly when there's consumer choice and they receive an email like I've received, your data's been breached,
yep.
The trust has been broken,
yep.
and the choice, unless there's some lock-in that you can't get what's being on offer anywhere else, I think that the writing's on the wall.
Yeah. Poll results. Do you know where your data's been held? We have yes at 40% and not sure 40%. So
okay, yeah, there you go. So this is something that applies to everybody, and if you're not sure, get professional help. I think that's the clear message coming from both sides here. Given that every company has a wide range of devices that staff use, from mobile phones to laptops to dozens of iPads and different things, to access, to share, to modify data through, every device obviously has access to your company data. Every device has the ability to store files, pictures, documents. How might these devices be a weak point? And how might they be dealt with, say, in the event of a company sale or some way of transitioning? How important are they?
Right. These days, especially with two-factor authentication, mobile devices and just devices generally are a extremely weak, frangible link in any chain of security. So think of it this way. You've been very diligent in locking down all your systems. You put two-factor authentication on all of your services and assets. You only use a VPN, and all of that is tied back to the highly secure environment of your iPhone. And you use a password manager. And there is a single key password that then accesses every password in your life, and you lose that master password. That phone is the weakest link in all of that labor to lock down the security of your network and services. So what security do you put around your mobile phone? Yep, great question. The media is littered with examples of USB sticks and laptops and mobile phones of government officials and corporate officials going missing. So the need to have offline backups, consider should you have a completely analog version of all your data offline that can't be touched by an online hacker. Not relying on services like Dropbox to be primary backup for a business are all things which have to be considered. But then the other thing is that in the event of the death or disability of a corporate member, operator, founder, someone who's got a substantial connection to a business, well, you've got to make sure that the will actually gives control of those assets back to the business. Of course, that in the event of someone's disabled, that the business and the family knows that these assets are relating to the integrity of operation of the business. This is part of your personal estate planning and administration, not just the administration of your business. So there is a need to tie together the connection between the personal life of an individual and their family and the integrity of operations of any businesses that they are connected to. That needs to be worked through on a case-by-case basis, and you need to be working with general counsel and advisors who are skilled at operating across the commercial and personal domains concurrently, like Quinco.
Awesome, thank you. You mentioned cookies earlier on. They're advertised by users as a legitimate tool to deliver content of interest, but how is this balanced against privacy? Because doesn't this fall under the Australian privacy policy codes or the APPs?
No, as I was saying before, cookies themselves are not, unless they are cookies that are able to be linked to someone's identity, which is generally not the case. They are not governed by the Privacy Act, and as such, no Australian business needs to have a cookie policy on their website. But then you're going to ask me, well, James, why do I see it all the time?
All the time, it's there, We collect.
We collect cookies, and our law firm uses it as well. And the reason we use it is best practice, is we know that this is the law playing catch up. Eventually, the Australian government will recognise that the cookies can be used to gather information about people, and the expectation of a user of a website is that they will be told if cookies are going to be collected. And that comes back again from the EU, because back in 2011 they introduced the EU cookie law, which is the e-privacy directive, cookie law 2011, and that forced the EU companies to put in place cookie banners and warnings, because they're not allowed to use cookies unless there is some sort of consent obtained first. And then as users interacted with the EU sites, that became an expectation, and as businesses became more professional, global businesses did it as a matter of course, and then it filters down, and that's why we see it today.
Great. So that's reasonable to say, well, what are other countries doing in that case? Because obviously law is playing catch up here.
Well,
so what are other countries doing that we could learn from here?
Well, in the USA, the USA.gov website, they don't really have a law that specifically prohibits collection of cookies, but they have advice where they help users in their browser settings turn off cookies. So therefore, no cookies can be collected, or there'll be a warning come up on your screen that you can permit or not permit whether or not you want to grant access. They're also putting together a central repository of all of the websites that collect cookies or whatever, or where you can register where you don't want to get them, that type of thing. So they're putting in place user activated procedures to protect if they so choose. So it's a voluntary system in the US.
And you mentioned Europe as another domain that have been very proactive in terms.
Well, they're the ones who led the cookie law legislation, and the reason why you're seeing the cookie banners on websites.
Right.
And it seems like every browser that you use these days too has the options very clearly to go into a private mode where no cookies are actually tracked too. So even on your phone and every device, that you literally can switch into a private mode with one click of a finger. So,
sure.
And they put a part of their policies to allow the user to
provide that anonymity.
Yeah. And I think this is where we come back to, from a small business perspective, that businesses need to take a decision about at a policy level about how they're going to police these things, because you can configure your system, your network, your desktops to have browsers that automatically have those cookies, that cookie function turned off. So there is a straightforward way. Yes, it does need some technical skill, but business owners can make these decisions in advance and can enforce these policies. So so whether we're talking about connection to the US, connection to Europe, or just simply struggling to stay local, every business needs to make a decision about either how they react to a connection, or prove that potential connection is not relevant to them. Which goes back to the point Guy was making, is that there is not one business in Australia of any scale, in any place in Australia, that is unaffected by these issues. How affected you are by them will depend very much on the dynamics and nature of your business. However, if you believe that this is irrelevant to you, you still have a compliance obligation to run your business so you can demonstrate the fact of that.
As a small business owner, I know words like compliance, privacy policies, etc. sounds like I need to be a massive company with a board, right? So, and that's something I'm realizing very quickly as every new client we also get, that they're asking for our privacy policy, they're asking for our data breach policies and everything else we have in place. That as long as you're on the internet and you're online and you're collecting information, that these things are serious issues that you can get in trouble and shut down your business.
So what we were talking about before, Phil, was about while a lot of SMEs are not required to have a privacy policy, if you're engaging with another business, B2B, are they going to want to deal with you if you don't have one? Because they want to know they're trusting the data across. They have a responsibility to their customers that if they're going to collaborate with you, that you need to be at the same
So
level.
I'm hearing you really need to take an approach as a small business from what would my customers expect, how would I like my data to be dealt with, rather than looking at the legal requirements, which are, as you say, still developing, still coming, it's playing catch up. But look at it from a much longer term point of view and go, what's my reputation risk if I don't play the game right with my clients?
Well, that's right, but I think also there's a larger context in this. Ultimately, you want to bring in a partner, get finance, grow the business, or sell the business. So, so unless you're, say, for example, a doctor who runs a medical practice company only to vend his expertise to the market, and if anything happens to the doctor, that company's going to die. So, absolute key man risk. And absent something like that, you're going to have at some point in the life of the business to prove that you own and control all the data in a form that can be handed over to a third party. The interest of a financier if you're going for bank finance, the interest of a co-owner if you're bringing someone else into the business. So if you're not thinking about how do I evidence what I own, as a fundament, running a business is not just about income and expenses. It's about assets and liabilities.
Can I add to that, Michael? If you have a customer database and those customers are based in the EU, you're going to have to be able to prove that you got the consent of those clients in your database to communicate with them.
Absolutely. So let's just take this up a level, and let's just think. Okay. All this stuff about digital assets, really, really important. But the level above that is, okay, how do I recognize the things about my business that will endure? I'm investing in my business. There will be artifacts that I generate that will endure, that I'll have to transact later in the business. What James has said, absolute great example. Right. Well, that should be part of how you operate the business with a view to tracking what's valuable, what's transactable. So that forms part of your accounting policy, and you've got to start thinking of these endurable elements of your business as assets. And all of a sudden, digital assets just become part of this larger investment story in your business. So the advice to growth businesses that we act for is develop your accounting policies to recognize those elements of your business, because come the day that you've got to either sell or finance, you're going to have to come back to this issue of transactability and define what you can control and what contributes to the ongoing operation of your business. You're never too small to start defining those things for yourself as they're created.
And I agree. I mean, startup world, we have a saying of when you're just starting, you're looking at your exit straight away. So what would you have in place to exit tomorrow at any one stage? So it goes with all the systems in place and all the policies. And going back to what you said, your database, James, like having a database and being in the EU, some people, is that a liability for someone who's buying or financing my company or joining the company?
Yeah.
It could be, right?
Yeah.
So interesting things to actually consider there.
Yeah, and that's why I think that for anyone who owns or controls a business, you know, you've got to think of, well, what's the safety net around the business? And from my point of view, it comes back to one simple mantra: policy before strategy before action. Understand the relevant policies and the risks they respond to. Develop strategies that you can support in the operation of the business, then get down to the detail of hiring someone to fix the problem or address the issue. If you just reflectively go to a solution without getting the policy and strategy in right, you are undermining the long-term stability of your business.
Can I add to that, Michael? The policy is the written policy. It needs to be embedded within the organisation, in your culture, so that the people, you can rely upon them and you know that they are actually following, because there can be all the best policies in the world, but again, the human link is the missing element, you know, that gets preyed upon, and you just have someone fall short of the policy and it's all is lost. So.
Well, absolutely, and I think we've all been in business long enough to know that leadership starts at the top. So if you're at the top of a business and you feel that you're an aging Luddite, that is an enormous, and you can just abdicate responsibility of these issues to the young Turks around you, you become then subject to their vagaries, their whims. So leadership starts at the top. And I agree with you. Embedding this in the culture of the business is absolutely vital. It affects HR, it affects who you bring on board, how you bring them on board, and it puts some pretty solid technical knowledge requirements in how you hire in the first place. Because if you might have someone who might be technically excellent, but just but believes in that the internet should be free.
So that probably applies to me quite well. You brought up terms and conditions just now. Every new service provider that I come across has read the terms and conditions here, and occasionally you click on it and it's pages and pages and pages of legal jargon. You go, yeah, we'll look after it. Yeah, tick, and you basically sign it away. So how important is that aspect for a company, to have those? I mean, you've touched on it before and gone, look, it's important to have there. But again, how important it is for them to read all those terms and conditions and understand them for the providers for their business?
Well, I think you need to go again to best practice, and the way that the legal industry is trying to, or certain parts of the legal industry are trying to lead the way here is getting and using legal design so that you have an understandable set of terms and conditions.
That'd be tremendous.
Yeah, I looked at developing a user-friendly privacy policy from scratch, and found Ubenda, which is an Italian company, and we've ended up partnering with them. They actually provide a nice user interface to a privacy policy that will probably still won't get read by everyone, but certainly is a big step up.
Could be understood.
It could be understood by a lot of people, can be navigated easily, has a high level that you can drill down from, so you get the synopsis of what's going on. And when customers see that and see that you're making an effort, the trust is starting to be built to a higher level. That's how you're going to be getting new clients. Clients have a choice or customers have a choice as to where they want to take their business. And if they think that you're making a higher effort to communicate and be transparent about what you're doing, and you have the systems in place and do it in a way that's easy to understand if they want to, you're gonna have a competitive advantage. Client experience includes the terms and conditions and privacy policy and cookie policy and whatever that you have on your website. Because if you don't have any of those things, you're not going to be at the same level in the customer's view.
What you're saying is basically use this area of your business not as a lost income, as an expense, as a difficulty, but actually use it as a leverage to show value to your clients.
Yeah. Well, to build the expectation of the client is at a point where privacy is paramount, and the more spam emails we get, the more cases we hear about identity theft, the more these things happen, the more sensitive the customers are to these exact things. So the more attention business needs to pay.
Well, that's right. And something I've just noticed, because my law firm's on Microsoft Office 365 in the cloud.
Yes.
And last week, a new version of Outlook got pushed out by Microsoft that splits your inbox now into Focus and Other. And the algorithms that are running the classification of email are actually pretty damn good. I think they've got it. I think they've got it largely, 90% right. So, so there's the opportunity now to be more active in discrimination, and but then you look at that and you go, right, well, how do I switch that? Actually, switch that off. That's going to be an issue that we can now address more efficiently.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that we need to think on in being in business in the first place is, to what extent are we selling a client experience rather than, or a customer experience in the service that we deliver, than a product and service? And I think increasingly the businesses that are growing are the ones that are selling a client experience. And I think where you're essentially a professional service provider and you're using online tools to support the delivery of your service, then making sure that we build these elements of trust around the business is vital, because the one thing we can guarantee is that personalization is not going to be compromised by technology. Whatever we do to personalize a product, a service, and experience is going to be what ultimately our clients are paying us for. That's why businesses are very quickly becoming more and more reliant on reputation as being an anchor for trust within the business. So I think that if your business is doing more than just flogging widgets on the web, these issues are going to become more and more important as time goes on.
Great.
Wow, absolutely. Well, I'm sure you'll agree that there's a lot more to business security than you might like to admit, but it pays to be aware. So act before you have to act. In summary, there are a number of points that I've taken out of the questions that we've done today that will help business owners sort of manage and secure data. And I think the first is that you must do something. At the very least, lock down your jurisdiction to your own minimum sort of area in your terms of service. I think the other thing is ask for help, because clearly this is an area that is very complex, that can potentially lead to criminal liability, and is worth getting some good advice from or on. The point that you made about client expectations being more important than the minimum legal requirements, I think was aptly made. So look at it from your client's perspective and meet their expectations, which are growing. Exceed your minimum legal requirements. I think that's the point made there, and I think it was very well made. Business Propel does a whole range of diagnostics. If you're interested in doing a specific diagnostic on this topic, then send us a message and we'll put one together for you. But I think it's an important area of business, and I think it's something that we'd be more than happy to put together a checklist for you, if you like, of issues that you should be considering and measuring your business against. So Business Propel is happy to do that for us, Phil, I understand. Yes,
of course, and as a small business, it's so important that you have something simple to understand that you can work off, and you know where to actually get the help, which I found actually really difficult. Who's an expert? Who can you trust? Who's done this before too? Because sometimes it's easy going to someone you find off the internet, but it's also important knowing someone with a background that know what they're talking about. It will save you a lot of time, a lot of heartache at the same time, and a lot of money. Obviously, time is money. But at the end of the day, we will put a checklist together on some simple stuff that you can actually do today to figure out where you sit, where you need to sit, and where you need to go. Gentlemen, we do have a question. If we have time, we have a couple minutes. So I'm thinking, well, it's about privacy policy, so I'm going to read it out. We can give it a couple minutes to decide. Okay, so the question is, would I be right to think if I have a privacy policy that explains the nature of the business and how, where, and when and who with the information you shared with would I be covered in a breaches obligation?
It's a very bit unclear as to what they're actually asking. Having a privacy policy by itself does not protect you if you breach the data and it is left, it is lost by your organisation.
Yep.
If you do, there will be a responsibility if there's likely to be serious harm that you need to notify the people affected and follow certain protocols so that they know what they can do. Typically though, if you're an SME, you might not be regulated by the Privacy Act, and therefore you might, if you don't collect tax file numbers, you might not need to notify. But if you have breached and you don't tell the customers and they find out that you have breached, that could go viral on Twitter, Facebook, anywhere else, and it could be worse than actually telling them that there's a problem.
James, that brings me to a point that you made before we started today, and that was that ransom is one of the issues that is happening on a more and more regular basis. People's data is hacked. They put something in there that locks down all your data, and essentially they have access to it. If you pay your money, often you get the data back. But what does that mean in terms of having a separate copy or somewhere where you can access all your information of your clients? Because if you've got to notify them and all your data is locked down, how do you do that? And that's part of the problem of having all your data online. If it suddenly gets lost, how do you access it?
Yeah. And I think it's important to also consider that managers and directors and officers can all have personal liability for their actions inside a company that creates damage to third parties. So you can't just sit here and say, hey, because I'm someone's employee, I'm safe from personal liability. If you're an entrepreneur, if you're an officer or a manager of a corporation in business, unless you get this stuff right, you can end up risking your family home, your superannuation, and everything.
Interestingly though, and this is from lawyers always like the details, but interestingly in the Privacy Act, the company itself is exempt from any criminal liability, whereas individuals are not. So while your company might be safe, individuals not.
You can get in trouble, basically.
Be afraid.
Which is scary. As a small business, you're looking at making profit, but also staying out of prison by the sounds of it.
Yeah.
And losing everything you have.
And I think this is just the reality of legal compliance these days. What we historically might have thought of as civil liability only. So, okay, I get a fine, I get a slap on the wrist, but no enduring problem around me. Increasingly, the law is criminalising what historically might have thought of as civil conduct. And that's the problem.
Outside of the Privacy Act, work health and safety, other areas where there is recklessness, there can be criminal responsibility, and having a policy is not enough. If your organisation has a culture of non-compliance, it can generate the criminal liability in the criminal code for your company as well as directors and officers.
Okay. We're almost out of time.
All right.
Yep.
Fine. So make sure you're aware of all your devices, make sure that you get some help, and make sure you take action. My thanks again on your behalf to Business Propel for bringing the session about, to James Ford from Blue Ocean Law, Michael Perkins from Nexus Legal. I trust you found today's session of value to your business. If you have got any further questions, do send them in. We'd love to hear from you. More than happy to answer them. And I hope you can join us for our next session on this digital life journey, where we will be exploring this move beyond digital fingerprints to discuss the implications of conversational commerce and Smile as ways of signing documents and logging into accounts. So until next time, cheers and have a great week.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.